One time can kill you, one time.
The stories are heartbreaking.
I had no faith, I had no care in the world. Everything is derived around when am I gonna get that next drug or when am I gonna get that next fix.
The problem overwhelming.
The indictments of 24 individuals charged with drug trafficking and money.
And the solutions not easy.
Just the stuff that I grew up on doesn't work, and that's the coercion, the manipulation, and the scare tactics.
By far the most common demographic for heroin deaths. According to the Jefferson County coroner, white males in their 30s. The numbers first exploded in 2014, 137 deaths, up from 58 the year before, and so far this year, 73 confirmed. Experts say talking about the problem is key. Middle school age is not too young.
If I could talk to one parent out there, I would say talk to your children. You know, don't hide things from them. Tell them the truth about drugs like heroin.
The epidemic cuts across all communities, and as awareness grows, meetings like this one draw hundreds.
But I ended up becoming a heroin addict.
Young adults show us the changing face of today's heroin addict.
I shouldn't be here today with the stuff that I was doing and the lifestyle that I was living.
Talking openly is an important first step. Education the next.
Professionals, attorneys, doctors, kids from over the mountain, very commonly. I mean, no one's immune from this.
Now we know many addictions to heroin follow a similar path, a prescription for painkillers, then cheaper, more available heroin, followed by a painful downward spiral. The message from those who treat addictions, recovery is possible.
Don't just throw people away just because you see them homeless or just because you see them addicted to drugs. Don't just throw them away because there's a root to every problem.
Gone are the days we can say, not my problem. From the medical community to police to our hometowns, this has become everyone's problem. I'm Cynthia Gould reporting.
Your voice, your future. We're battling heroin tonight during this 1-hour roundtable special. I'm Anora Gathings, and I'll be looking for your questions on social media. So send us a Facebook message or comment on our page using hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture or hashtag battling heroin. We will also have the crisis center number on the screen throughout the special. That telephone number is 205-323-7782. The line is open 24 hours a day, every day, and your call is confidential. Well, we have an intriguing panel here tonight to answer your questions and get real about the heroin epidemic. Cynthia Gould introduces us to the panelists.
Shandor Cheka is Executive Director of the Addiction Prevention Coalition. Cheka has a strong calling to this type of work because of the impact addiction has had on family and friends. The organization was recognized by the Department of Health and Human Services as a coalition to model. Danny Malloy is a program support specialist with the Addiction Prevention Coalition. After many rehabs and hospital stays to overcome a 15-year addiction, he came to Alabama and graduated from the Foundry in Bessemer. He shares his powerful story at schools, rehabs, and various venues throughout the community. Brandon Falls is the district attorney for the 10th Judicial Circuit of Alabama in Jefferson County, the largest jurisdiction in the state, which covers 27 police departments. Falls has worked in the DA's office since 1997 before being appointed to lead it in 2008. Susan Brawley is a Birmingham mother who lost her son to a heroin overdose. Brawley shares her story of the struggles she went through with her son and the steps she's taken since his death.
46,471 people died from drug overdoses last year. Drug overdoses is now the leading cause of injury deaths in America, more so than motor vehicle accidents, more than firearms-related deaths. And as far as drug overdoses are concerned, it's from both, half of all drug overdoses are from prescription painkillers or heroin. Good evening, I'm Mark Hyman, host of Behind the Headlines. Thank you for joining us. There are no age, gender, race, or income boundaries. Heroin is the most indiscriminate killer. This is indeed a public health crisis. Now, we've assembled a terrific panel. You just met them in our introduction. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. I want to start off this evening with you, our district attorney, Mr. Falls. For many people, heroin was that drug from the 1960s and 70s that was wiped out of existence, and yet it's come back almost with a vengeance. Why is that?
Well, one of the major reasons that that we're seeing this resurgence of heroin is the progression from prescription opioids. Folks that are getting these prescriptions for legitimate purposes, they develop an addiction. Once they go off that prescription, once they can't obtain those drugs legally, they move to obtaining them illegally. So we see a lot of cases, tons of cases. Folks with 2, 3, 4, 5 pills in their pocket, no prescription at all. When they're unable to get that prescription drug, they move to heroin. Heroin is cheaper. It's easier to find right now. It's become the cheapest drug as compared to cocaine. And it's just so addictive that once someone starts, they can't stop.
And follow up on the whole issue of prescription and overprescribing of medications. The Journal of American Medical Association just came out with a report yesterday and said that 59% of Americans now have some sort of prescribed drug. 8% of Americans have 5 or more prescribed drugs. As someone who works with addictions and so forth, what have you seen, and what are some of the concerns that we should have by the public at large at all these prescriptions that are out there and people taking medication?
Well, I think it tells us about our society in that we're a society that wants a quick fix. So oftentimes we run to a medicine cabinet for that purpose. And we teach children from the time that they're very young that if you have a problem, go to the medicine cabinet. And even we see parents giving their children their own drugs, the parents' drugs, to help with pain. And really what we want to really address today is that it's more than just the prescription mentality that we got to address. We also have to address the idea of we're going to save some of these away and put them away for later. Because a lot of our kids, 64% of kids in our area get them from a friend or family member in a medicine cabinet somewhere. And that's the introduction to opiates for them. And the biggest thing is that in Alabama that we have, we're the #1 prescribing state for prescription drugs, specifically the narcotic variety.
And in your experience, Reverend, have any of the clients you've dealt with said to you, I realized I was at this tipping point when this happened? At what point do people realize that, whereas they may have been taking a prescribed drug for an ailment of some type, an injury, an illness, that it became an addiction, they wanted more and more? Is there some point where they reach that epiphany, that light goes off and say, I've gone too far?
I think there is, but I think it's, even on the front end, they're taking it for a pain, legitimate prescription, and they realize it makes them feel better. Not for the pain, but for some other issue that they're dealing with, whether that's a deep emotional wound, whether that's a depression issue. Lots of these people are taking these because of self-medication, and that's where it starts. And once they realize, okay, I've had enough of this, and they start trying to come off it, that's when they realize, I can't come off it anymore. And so they go back to the doctor, try to get a refill on their prescription, and if that doesn't work, then they'll try to find those same prescriptions on the street. And as Brandon has already said, when they move from, I can't afford this anymore because an Oxycontin cost me $80 on the street, but a shot of heroin cost me $20, it just becomes pure economics at that point for those folks.
Well, let's bring Mr. Malloy in the conversation because you have a lot of firsthand experience with this. Can you just share with us briefly how you went through this process that you went down this unfortunate path and became addicted to heroin?
Sure. You know, in high school, I grew up in Boston. I kind of started drinking, smoking pot. Wasn't really a big deal at the time, but I remember when I first took a Loratab, which is a narcotic painkiller, it made me feel great, and it relieved this emotional pain. I had a lot of trauma in my life growing up, and it made me feel great for 3 hours, and then it would go away. So I just remember saying, I want to do this all the time, and I started getting more painkillers and trying to get them every day, and still didn't know that I was addicted. And when I started taking Oxycontin and started selling Oxycontin, and I got arrested, and I quickly realized that I can't do this anymore, I'm going to go to jail. I was on probation. And someone came along and said, well, you know, heroin feels exactly the same, and it's cheaper, and I can get you tons of it. And I said I would never do it, but when you're sick from not having drugs, you'll do anything. And that's what I did, and I did heroin straight for about 4 years.
I'm going to ask you a really uncomfortable question. Talk about the role of your family, or was there a role with your family in this process, and how did you either keep them in the dark, or were they not involved?
Sure. My mother and father got divorced when I was young. Mother moved out of state. Father was an alcoholic, struggled with alcohol most of his life, and I was a witness to that. So I was raised by my aunt, which was my father's sister. She knew there was a problem. There was a problem in the family. I was just telling Mr. Falls earlier that I met one of my uncles in prison, and it's just a known issue that we have in our family. And, you know, my aunt would always try to help me and try to keep me away from it, but I didn't have that role model in my life, that male figure, and I had a lot of emotional pain from just traumas. And, you know, my aunt always tried to do the best she could, but at some point the drugs took a hold of me and there was no getting me back.
Yeah, Ms. Brawley, you have said that a parent can't love their child out of addiction. So even for those families who have that close relationship and the parents so deeply involved, can you just describe for us kind of that frustration, that the emotion you bring in and what you bring in, the parenting skills, that oftentimes isn't enough?
Well, it is very frustrating because you feel like you've done your job as a parent, that you've loved your child and you've provided them with all the opportunities available, you know, a good education, a good home, a family that loves them. And you, for that reason, you sort of live in this state of denial that this is not going to happen to my child, because I love my child so much and because my child has all these things available to them. And he's a good kid, so he's not going to go down that path. It's a very frustrating, very guilt-ridden path as a parent. But I think denial plays a huge part in that.
Mr. Malloy, you talked about starting off with drinking and smoking marijuana, and this has been a raging debate all across the country, particularly with several states that have legalized marijuana, not only for medicinal use, but also for recreational use. In your opinion, is marijuana a gateway drug?
I think it can be. I mean, I think there's a lot of gateway drugs. I think a drug is a drug. So for me, if I couldn't get marijuana, I would get something else and I would go from there, you know, so Xanax, things like that. So I do think, you know, we can find beneficial purposes for things medicinally, but I think it's going to take a lot more than just, hey, let's legalize this and let's all smoke marijuana. I think there's going to, you know, we're going to have to seriously look into these things. But absolutely, I mean, everyone starts somewhere. So.
And Mr. Falls, the whole phenomena of recreational marijuana has only been a recent one in the last few years. So while it was illegal, there have been legal drugs, and you mentioned opiates. And the data shows the number of people who were on prescribed medications, as you said, have gone on. So are these prescription medications also that gateway for the illicit drug activity?
Sure, sure. When you're looking at the issue of legalization, you're exactly right. We have legal drugs that are being abused. People are developing addictions to them, and there are legal methods for obtaining them, and they are just as addictive as heroin or other substances. So it's not really just a matter of saying, well, if we just legalize this across the board, we're going to save ourselves either money or we're going to save ourselves the amount of time that the police have to work these cases. Really, you're just setting yourself up for failure in the long run because of the addictive nature and the overdose deaths that you're going to face.
Now, a few moments ago, the Reverend mentioned that Alabama has the most prescriptions of any state in the country. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, there are 143 prescriptions written for every 100 people in Alabama.
Right.
Why is that the case? I mean, certainly somebody has to be number one, but why is it Alabama? And what are some of the steps, perhaps, that can be taken to, if not rein that number in, at least have greater oversight to figure out why this is happening?
So I think we're number one or number two in the country for hydrocodone. I think we're about number 15 for oxycodone. So those are some huge numbers. So you have law enforcement doing what they can, and that's focusing on the supply chain, whether that is drugs that are coming in illegally or whether that is doctors who are overprescribing. So one of the steps that we've taken here locally is the pills to needles effort that we're making, not only to make the doctors, the medical community aware of the issues, of the problems, bring together the faith community, parents, law enforcement. So that first step, I think, is exactly what we're doing tonight, letting everyone know that there is a definite problem in central Alabama that needs to be addressed. And second, looking at solutions, whatever we can possibly do to lower those numbers. There's really only so much that law enforcement can do. You know, with arrests, sending someone to prison, but there just seemed to be one distributor after another ready to take the place of anyone that we put in jail.
And one more quick follow-up with you before I move on with the Reverend. There was a recent pair of arrests here in Alabama. A couple of doctors were accused of running a pills mill in which they were alleged to have written 273,000 prescriptions over a 4.5-year period, which is an average of about 30 prescriptions an hour. So while we presume that most doctors, most medical doctors who write prescriptions are doing so legally, they're doing it with all the best intentions, they follow the Hippocratic Oath, we still have potentially, allegedly in this case, a couple doctors who may be misbehaving. How do we track that? Is that something that's easy to keep an eye on? Are there mechanisms in place at the federal level, the state level?
There are mechanisms in place, and it takes investigation by law enforcement. Some of the obvious signs would be folks from out of state lining up outside of a doctor's office. You know, folks don't go from Kentucky to Alabama to get their prescriptions filled. And so what law enforcement sees is these places just overflowing with people coming in and out, getting that prescription. There are some mechanisms for following those numbers of prescriptions and focusing on certain persons without giving too much away. But it takes a huge effort on law enforcement's part. And even when you have that, Alabama does not have the laws in place to fight that like the federal system does. So your prosecutions are most often going to be federal. We do need some legislation in Alabama to focus on doctors who are prescribing for no valid medical reason.
A lot of good discussion so far this evening on this particular topic. Before I follow up with the Reverend, I do want to find out what our viewers think about this, because they've been weighing on this topic for several days now. So let's check in with Honora. What do you have for us?
Well, Mark, our viewers are using hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture to ask questions tonight. And one of the big concerns that I'm seeing is people saying when they want help, they're unable to get it. Trisha Hammond says as a mother of a recovering heroin addict, she knows the struggle. She says for years she could not get her daughter into rehab. Treatment centers would not call back, and others had extremely high fees. So let's ask our panel, Mark, where can people go when they simply need some help?
Reverend, right up your alley.
Yeah, and we do have a dichotomy because we have 122,000 people that need treatment in our region. And we only have about 13,000 beds for these folks. So we do have a major issue, and it's something we have to address not only from the private pay system to the state system. This is a major issue, and it oftentimes starts on the prevention side of things. We've got to do better in preventing this issue from ever starting. We've got to figure out why are kids running to this for their depression, why do we have so much emotional trauma that we're dealing with, and we've got to address those things first. You know, we have a website, addictionpreventioncoalition.org, that you can go to that has a wealth of resources. We have 140 so resources on that page that people can go and track and say, okay, based on where I am, this is what I need. But the reality is we have detox facilities. We only have 2 state-certified detox facilities in the state of Alabama. We have several local hospitals that will do detox, but it's much more difficult to kind of navigate that process. But you know, the truth is there is hope out there, and the state will work with you. We'll work with you if you call our office, 874-8498. We aren't there all the time, but during normal business hours we are there, and we always return phone calls. But the reality is a lot of times it just takes somebody to kind of help people through this process, because you know they'll go to a rehab facility and it's a 30-day facility, and that's so important. But recovery is a long-term process. It's not a quick fix thing. If you look at the research, it says recovery takes about 2 to 3 years for the brain to kind of revert and kind of rewire itself to where it was from the beginning. And if you aren't rewiring yourself in 30 days, you're going to have those same cravings coming out of it. So you're having those transitional housing facilities that are going to be positive in nature and not just a, well, here's a halfway home, but you know, folks that are really invested in your recovery. And so oftentimes we tell people, also look at the root causes of the issue. It's not just about getting people off the drugs. It's about finding why did they start to begin with. And once you drill down to that level and figure that out, that's when they have the best chance of success.
So there are those inpatient rehab facilities. What about the role of a methadone clinic? How does that fit into the process, and is that sort of that transitional phase after that original detox? And how successful have those been at that medical aspect of it?
Well, from the medical standpoint, I mean, there are three types of treatment, basically. You've got your medical, which is methadone, which is really not detoxing at all. It's really just continuing somebody's uses of an opiate over time. The FDA approved methadone, Suboxone, those types of things for a 2-year step-down process. That's the FDA, that's not me, so if somebody gets mad, we can take it up with them. But lots of times, methadone clinics, Suboxone clinics will keep people on these for, I've heard, up to 18, 20 years. And that's not helping somebody really deal with the issues at hand. Part of the process of that Suboxone treatment ought to be, why are you using in the first place? And let's deal with those major issues first, and then help you wean off the process. But oftentimes we see that's not really the case. But there are other opportunities besides medical. I mean, you have the 12-step programs, which are support group driven, that are very effective, and you also have a faith component. And what's interesting is most places, whether it's medical, 12-step, or spiritual, will tell you the spiritual component has to be there. You have to have something else to hope in beside yourself for your recovery.
And Mr. Malloy, and that's interesting the Reverend brought that up, because there are aspects of faith that have come under attack in this country. Yet when we look at 12-step programs and recovery groups and so forth, there is some, as the Reverend mentioned, a faith or a spiritual component to it. And you've been down that path. Can you share with us perhaps what it do for you in terms of how did it help you through this process, and why is that necessary for the recovery for some people?
Sure. So in my case, I am 37 years old, so it kind of tells you when I was in high school. I graduated in 1996, right around the time that society started getting further and further away from faith-type things, and it was politically incorrect. So I moved along with society. So I never really looked at faith as an option for me to get help at all. I just never even thought about it. And if I can just be honest with you, I've been to over 20 rehabs. I've been to 5 psychiatric units. I have been arrested for drug distribution. I've watched people die in front of me. People in my family have died. I got down on my knees and I asked God to change my life, and He did. And that was the only thing that changed me. So I believe it's huge for some people. For me, it was everything.
And let's talk about the person for a moment, because it's my sense that someone such as yourself, who's actually been down the wrong path, has a lot more credibility than perhaps if I was to try to counsel someone, because I can say all the right words. You've had the experiences. What kind of feedback have you gotten from those people you've worked with as a counselor?
Well, I mean, people really, I got a phone call today at the Addiction Prevention Coalition, and it just really broke my heart, because I know where this woman was at. She was crying on the phone, and she said, nobody will call me back. I can't get into a place. I'm on heroin. I have kids. I have nowhere to go. And I know that pain. It's almost like an impossible feeling. But the feedback, I mean, people really do want help, believe it or not. I mean, addicts, they're doing things that people are like, this person does not want help. They're stealing from me. They're pushing me away. But deep down inside, people are using because of pain, and they just really need help. We see a good experience as far as helping people into programs. Even if they're acting like they don't want to go, people generally do.
And for our viewers who perhaps have this addiction and are watching right now, Ms. Brawley, your son Aaron talked to you about the demon. And for those of us who perhaps haven't been involved, it may be difficult to understand, but can you at least share with our viewers kind of what that meant, and what you got from it, and what are some of the signs perhaps parents should look for?
Well, once he really got into his addiction and it became obvious what was going on, then we started having these honest discussions about it. Before that, it was lying and covering up and just leading this double life. But once I became aware of how involved he was with drugs, and that more than likely addiction was taking hold, that's when he told me. He said, "Mom, you don't understand the demon." And I started I did start understanding it by looking back at his behavior and how he told me, he said, I don't love my life, I don't like my life, I don't like myself. He said, I wish I was strong, I wish I could be like you, but you don't understand. And he was what I saw happen was my son changed right before me into this very sad, hopeless individual. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to help himself because it was almost like he was afraid. He would try to go without drugs, but then it hurts to go without drugs and you get sick. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but now I've had I've had 12 and a half years to look back on this, and the time he spent in the bathroom sick and the time that he spent just away from home where I didn't know where he was, and I think he was really truly battling with what to do with his life, but he was fearful, and that's part, when that addiction takes hold, it's not an easy path to try to get out of it without help. I mean, and he wanted to try to do it himself, but he wasn't able to do that. He wasn't able to do that.
And I want to follow up with that, and I think we're going to put in the screen some photos of what parents can look for. But there was a point where there was a particular event, a particular day, a particular time frame where kind of the light went off for you and you said, okay, now I know he's got a problem. Looking back at that, are there events that you looked at previous to that where you said, wow, that was a sign and I missed it? What are some of the things perhaps other parents should be looking for today if they have suspicion perhaps their child is doing something?
Well, early on it was just, I just kind of knew in my gut that things weren't quite right. That when he was a young teenager, I would smell beer or I'd smell cigarette smoke. But then, you know, you think teenagers do that sort of thing, and I would just sort of just wave it off as normal teenage behavior. But as years went on, especially once he got into college, there was a lot of lying, and things started disappearing from the house, and he would disappear I couldn't find him. I would go look for him at school, couldn't find him, and I had at one point had to get his landlord to unlock the door to his apartment and let me in, and there he was, passed out. But there's a lot of devious kind of lying kind of behavior, but as a parent it's hard to really see that at the time because again it goes back to the loving them so much, and this is not my child, this is not the way he was raised, this couldn't possibly be happening. But he was stealing from us, he was pawning his brother's guitar, he pawned his guitar, he took my ATM card, he knew my PIN number and wiped out my account. But as a parent, you just have to put aside that veil of denial, and if you have any gut feelings that something's going on, don't be afraid to have a very frank, honest discussion with your child. And I also, once I became suspicious, I started searching his room. And I mean, I felt like if he's breaking the rules, then the privacy issues were out the window. I would search his room, and then I also would drug test him. But then again, that opens another door. If you're going to drug test them, then you have to be willing to follow up. You have to have consequences, and you have to be willing to follow through with that. And I had problems with that. I admit that. I had problems with that, and again, because I was in denial, and I just loved him so. You love him so much. It just can't be happening to you.
I want to make sure our viewers know that while you were speaking, we showed on the screen photographs that another ABC 3340 viewer had shared with us, things around the house that looked like perhaps garbage or refuse or just things that were run astray. These were some of the signs. We'll post this on our Facebook page at facebook.com/ABC3340. You're welcome to look at those photographs. There's signs that you can look for in your own home that perhaps might indicate something that's going on you need to investigate further. So again, we'd like to thank our viewer who shared those with us. Mr. Falls, every drug enforcement agency at the federal and state level shows this virtual superhighway coming out of Mexico with drugs. And if anyone ever watched the old film, The French Connection, we tend to think of Southeast Asia. But according to the DEA, 4% of the heroin in this country today comes from Southeast Asia. Nearly all of it comes from Mexico. Yes. And it's interesting because we're in this climate now where there's discussion about open borders and immigration and so forth, and I don't want to get into that conversation. But the second part of this, if we have these open borders, we're allowing this delivery system to come into our country and deliver these Mexican-grown heroin.
Right. So at some point in the past 15, 20 years, it was just discovered that poppies grew very well in Mexican soil, South American soil. And as heroin has increased, it has supplanted cocaine, and so the traffickers are using the same routes that they were using for cocaine. So it's just become the new drug, their new product, their new way to make money. And we actually had this discussion. Danny and Sandra were there a few months ago when we were talking about this very issue. I asked the question of a DEA agent, the heroin that is coming into the country, is it coming in with someone who is entering the country legally? And the answer was no. So it is coming across the border, being carried by someone who's entering the country illegally. So what is the, I know you don't get into that discussion, but that is a stark fact that we have to look at in this. You look at the number of deaths every year nationally, and I think we're in Jefferson County, it looks like, and I'm hopeful that we are going to be lower than last year. But you look at the national numbers past several years and compare those to Jefferson County's numbers, and quite honestly, I was afraid we were going to go from 137 deaths to 200 plus. If you focus on that and say, if we shut down this supply chain, how many lives are we going to save across the country? It really changes your perspective of what we should be focusing on and how we should be addressing this supply issue.
And I think you raise an interesting point, because there's really four components, if you think about to the illicit drug trade. There's the production, the transportation, the distribution, and the consumption.
Right.
And I think it's fair to say that most Americans tend to think of the consumption side, that if we crack a few more skulls, we have stiffer sentences, we'll make it go away. And while some of that may be true, it's really, if we can remove any one of those components, or certainly lessen them quite a bit. If you end the production, we don't have to worry about distribution, transportation, and consumption. We're certainly sensitive about the political issues when people talk about borders and immigration, and I didn't want anyone to think we're trying to politicize them in that regard. But certainly, I think here at ABC 3340 and our colleagues throughout the country perhaps ought to put the camera on ourselves, that perhaps we should do a better job of highlighting that the production is taking place just over the border. Because most Americans today, I think, would believe it's still Southeast Asia, and yet it's almost entirely Mexico with a little bit of Colombia. And so it's a problem that we need to focus on. And so we'll take that on board here at ABC 3340 and with our colleagues. Perhaps we could put a little more attention on this. Reverend, what are some of the steps that perhaps we haven't taken as a society to solve this problem? And I think about every First Lady has a signature program, and with Nancy Reagan it was Just Say No, and it actually was a subject of ridicule and derision by some people who said that's just so juvenile, it's so simple. But are we missing components of taking a tough stand and saying, look, it's really not a good road to go down, to drink when you're underage, to drink in excess, to do these things that are kind of vices?
Yeah, to me, I think it all stems from not allowing where it starts to have the voice. And where it's starting is in middle school, it's in our high schools. And we're not giving students the voice to talk about what the issues are. And we take it on a national scale and we say, okay, this is what we're going to talk about this year. We're going to talk about marijuana this year. And that's okay and that's wonderful. But at the same time, each school is so completely different. Even here in Birmingham, when you look at all the different school systems and all the different schools themselves, you realize how diverse they are. And so you try to force down a cookie-cutter mentality of what it is about prevention, and it just doesn't work. And you have to let these students come forward and say, you know what, I'm passionate about saving my school. I'm passionate about saving my kids at my school, and allowing them to have the voice to say, this is how we're going to change it. And allowing the grassroots, which is basically every great movement in this country has happened when we let grassroots kind of take hold and move forward.
Now, with all due respect, I'm sure you do a fantastic job, but if you go to a school and speak to a group of students in assembly, and then Mr. Malloy goes, I suspect you may get some feedback about the impact that perhaps he has as someone who was addicted. Is that what you've seen?
We do, but the reality still is that our prevention has always been a top-down approach. It's always been an authoritarian figure coming into the classroom and saying, don't do this because it's bad for you. Where if you have a 17-year-old, 16-year-old saying to their fellow classmates, yeah, I know it's fun and we understand that, but here's the reality of the long term of this. When we live in a society of you only live once, and we live in a society that just do whatever you feel, do whatever you can, make yourself feel better about yourself. And then we have a student standing up in that same culture and saying, it's not the best thing for us. That is much more impactful. And Danny does a great job when he goes into these schools, and he can make an impact. But it's that one-on-one connection when your 16-year-old says to a 17-year-old, you know what, my dad's an alcoholic. You know what, my mother's an alcoholic. My brother's an alcoholic. And I'm here because I don't want that to happen to me, and I don't want it to happen to y'all.
Yeah.
That's when we say major shifts.
And it's tough pulling the curtain back. I mean, for many people to come forward and say, I have problems at my home because of the way society reacts.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, with adolescents and middle school age children who like to tease and bully, it's going to be tough for someone to step forward. Yeah, speaking of stepping forward, I'm going to have to step forward and actually check in with our social media because our viewers have been weighing in on this topic for several days now. Honora, what's the latest?
Well, Mark, we are continuing to get questions. One viewer asks, why not have mandatory rehab for addicts when they've been arrested on drug charges? Mark, this viewer also wants our panelists to weigh in on why allow an adult addict to simply walk out of rehab.
Mr. District Attorney, kind of in your realm, and by the way, and if you have any insight in terms of on the medical side, because there may be health plans that may not look at providing support or the necessary support to someone because of they view it as misbehavior.
So when you go through the criminal justice system, the courts can place you in a drug court program, force you to go into a rehab treatment program, and they can say to you, listen, if you walk away from this, your choice is this or jail. So you're going to go to jail or you're going to go to prison. And I've had a friend whose son developed a heroin addiction, called me after his son was arrested and charged, and he and his wife had a trip planned. And he said, Brandon, can you do what you can to keep him in jail until we get back from this trip? Because if he gets out, he's either going to break into my house or he's going to die. And at least if he's in jail, I know he's going to be alive. And it's heartbreaking for someone to reach that point. The courts can do it. As far as giving someone that stick and forcing them to go into a program and staying in there, but when they walk out, the only final measure that the court has is to send someone to prison. And one of our biggest issues in the state right now is our funding for the Department of Corrections. The criminal justice system is supposed to be a deterrent, it's supposed to be about punishment, but it's also supposed to be about rehabilitation. And if you don't have the funding to rehabilitate someone who is an addict when they go in, and it doesn't matter whether they go in on a distribution charge or if it's a property charge, a burglary or a theft, if they have that addiction, when they go into the system, there have to be the services in place to get them off the drug. If you don't do that, when they come out, they're just going to reoffend. So for us, for Alabama right now, this is a major issue in the criminal justice system. How do we pay for this treatment? How do we avoid the recidivism that is going to be a result of someone not getting the proper treatment and getting off the drugs?
And that's actually become more of a discussion topic here in the last couple of years with people across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, saying we need to take a closer look at the incarceration of individuals, and do we really want to put people in jail for several years, perhaps a small amount of marijuana, and are we creating a problem? Any thoughts at where we're going? Certainly the conversation should occur without a doubt. We should at least discuss the larger issue of drug-related crimes and incarceration.
Well, when you look like a program like drug court, I think experts will tell you that it takes someone 4 or 5+ times to go through a drug court type program before they're successful. So that's one avenue, is looking at the programs in the court system, saying, okay, we're going to let you into this more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times, because in the long run, it's going to save the system money. It's going to save the state money. The numbers the actuality of numbers, at least in Alabama, are that very few people are going to prison just for drug offenses. When someone goes to prison, they've either they violated their probation over and over and over to the point that the judge says, "Listen, I don't know what else to do with you. Here, I've got to send you to prison," or they're going in with a drug charge plus some more serious offense, and really it's that more serious offense is the reason they end up in prison. The drug charge, the judge just says, "Listen, I'm going to put these together," and you go in. So sometimes when you look at those numbers, it looks a little inflated when someone's actually in for a harsher offense, but they're going ahead and serving that drug sentence out at the same time. It is a discussion going on across the country. Experts are telling us that to avoid repeating the offenses, to avoid recidivism, you need a program specific to someone's needs. It's a what's called risk-based assessment, and trying to craft a solution for this particular person. So it's a balance. It's a balance there. I don't think anyone has really gotten the perfect balance, because there's no program in the country with 0% recidivism. Every program has someone who commits a new offense within 3 years, and so it is the push, and then having that the carrot here, the stick there, and unfortunately sometimes that's what law enforcement has to be, and the prison system has to be.
And you mentioned the cost, and certainly in this day and age we tend to put a dollar sign on the human cost, and right now it's over $200 billion each year is the cost to illegal drug usage, and about $120 billion of that is attributed to loss of productivity, and it's over $50 billion is the cost for abuse of prescription medication. So it's about $250 billion cost to our country on an annual basis. But then of course there's the annual cost in terms of human life and human capital. About 8,600 people had drug overdoses from heroin last year. Right. And Ms. Brawley, let's talk for a moment about we certainly want to prevent it from happening. We want to prevent our children from being addicted. But once they get on that path, and there's that period where they seem to have that overdose. Certainly, Alabama is joining a number of other states now with something like Narcan, making it in greater availability beyond EMTs, so that family members could potentially have this for those. Can you share with us perhaps what this would do for those family members who have that child who's addicted, or a brother or a sister or even a parent, and have that availability so that, God forbid, they have that OD, at least we can stop them today and save that life?
Well, I can tell you that it saved my son. The year before he actually passed, he overdosed on Dilaudid. And you mentioned earlier that when I had the light went on that we were going down, had gotten serious. That was that moment when I realized he was injecting. And he would have died then, except that my daughter realized something was going on. She heard that his breathing was obstructed, and I had gone to bed, and she came and got me up. And I called the first responders, and they came and they administered Narcan. And basically that saved his life. I'm the one who found him when he passed. I came home from work and I found him unconscious in the bathroom. And I'm a registered nurse. I administered CPR, but Aaron had been down too long. But I can't tell you the numbers of times that I have wondered, had I had Narcan on hand, if that would have saved him. I don't know, and that's neither here nor there now, but it does go through your mind. But yes, it does save lives. I worked in the emergency room for years. I've administered Narcan to many overdoses come back like that. So it's extremely beneficial, it's extremely important as far as saving lives.
And Reverend, just quickly, and I want to check in with our social media desk in a moment, but why has there generally been the reluctance? Some states have moved rather slowly towards this. They seem to be concerned about some abuse of Narcan.
Yeah, I think it's a failed argument, to be honest with you, because lots of people think, well, if people have the availability of Narcan, they're going to take it with them, and then they're going to, use it if they need it. Well, the reality is by the time you realize you need it, you don't have the ability to use it. But what does happen,
so they think it may be an enabler that people say, now I can do it safely because I can treat myself.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure there's some people with that mentality out there, but the reality is I've heard from so many families, not just Susan, but so many families out there that said, I wish I'd had this. I wish it had been in my son's dorm. I wish it had been in my daughter's purse, so that people around them could administer it and possibly save their life. And that's the reality, is that heroin and opiates in general are so destructive that it attacks the brainstem and it just completely shuts you down. And Narcan is one of those things that it doesn't affect you if something else is going on with you and you inject Narcan, it's not going to hurt you. But it is so valuable to save people's lives. And I would rather have somebody here today walking around, even if they were addicted, I would rather them have the opportunity to find recovery than not have any hope at all.
This is a great time to check in to find out what the latest is with our viewers at home. Honora, what do you have for us?
Well, Mark, we have another question, and this one comes from Cassie Goskett, who asks, how could anyone love this drug more than their kid, or love any drug more than their child? Well, this question has a lot of people talking on social media. I know Mark, our panelists, can provide some great insight into this.
Mr. Malloy, for anyone who hasn't been addicted, alcohol, drugs, gambling, anything, addiction, can you explain the powerful draw that has? Because we know that addictions of any type have broken up families and marriages and relationships and businesses and so forth. How is that so powerful that for those of us who haven't been down that path, how do we understand that?
The only way I can explain it, and when I go talk to teenagers, this is how I explain it. So basically, our bodies are created to be hungry when we need food. You ever been underwater too long, you're swimming, and you hold your breath too long, you're trying to get to the top, you know you have to breathe, it's that fight. That's what being addicted is like. It's like waking up and knowing that you're gonna die if you don't go out and get whatever drug that your body needs. For one, my aunt raised me right. I would do anything, I would kill to get high. I mean, just being honest. There's no such thing as, well, I can't do this, I have my kid with me, or I can't do that, so-and-so will be mad at me. That's all out the window. You would do anything to get high at that point, because at that point it's not a choice. You're not just making a bad decision, you're trying to survive.
And for anyone who goes down the path and they take illicit drugs, certainly they bear the lion's share of responsibility, without a doubt. Having said that, does popular culture play a role in any of this?
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I talk about a lot. I feel like we can't overlook these pop stars and all these people, entertainment, all the, glamorizing it, making it cool. All these singers talking about popping Molly, and they're targeting the kids. And I grew up in that, and I started selling marijuana, it was listening to the music. I didn't have dad at home, so I was listening to the music that was telling me, yeah, just get high, sell the weed, and that really played a big role in my life. And I feel like in our culture, we have such an emphasis on entertainment. If we took a fraction of that and put it into trying to help get people off of drugs and open up facilities, we don't have, this problem has gotten so big, and we don't even look at popular culture and say, well, maybe that played a role in this. We just say, well, no, that's just the way we entertain each other. Well, that's not really funny. When someone ends up addicted to drugs and homeless, that's not funny, so why glamorize it?
And Ms. Brawley, as our viewer earlier had sent in the photographs of the paraphernalia she found with her daughter, and you certainly addressed a challenge I think that every parent in America has. What are those boundaries when we have children growing up? Because our children, in many respects, are much more mature. There's this information overload. They have access to everything with smartphones. They're very knowledgeable today. And we certainly, as parents, want to respect that privacy. But as you said, when you kind of violate the family rules, then it's time to unlock the doors and open things up. But can you talk about the balancing act? Because I'm sure the parents at home watching right now saying, I want to allow my son and daughter to be kind of a big kid and do their own thing and not violate that privacy.
Well, that's a tough one, because I feel like if you ever feel like there's something going on, that it's way more important to, you want them to be kids. But for example, I had a friend that I knew, I had gained information that his son was using pills. And when I provided him with that information, he basically said, oh, he's just being a teenager. Well, you can't allow them to just be teenagers when they're indulging in dangerous behavior. And if you have any suspicions whatsoever, it's your responsibility as a parent. And it kind of goes back to what I think I said earlier, that you just need to have these honest conversations with your children. And I think they need to start at a very young age about drugs and about their behavior and about consequences. And don't be afraid to ask these very direct questions. Don't be afraid to have these very honest conversations with them. Yes, you want to have a good relationship with your child, but you're their parent, you're not their friend. And as I used to tell my children, I said, this is not a democracy, this is a dictatorship, and I'm the dictator. And that's kind of the way I feel like it has to be sometimes. If kids are breaking rules, then you have to do what it takes, especially when it comes to drugs. I feel like kids these days, drugs are everywhere, and you make reference to the pop culture and the entertainment. When I go speak to the kids at school, I can see the complacency in their faces because they're just surrounded by drugs and the culture, and they have friends that are using and they're using, and it doesn't mean anything anymore. When I was a teenager, when you talked about heroin, I thought you were talking about this junkie behind a dumpster in New York City, not my son shooting up in his bedroom in Vestavia Hills. They've become so complacent. So I think our role as parent is, it's kind of almost becoming what it used to be back in the day. You're not their friend, you're their parent. I think that's the bottom line.
And Reverend, I want to check with you on something, and then I want to also find out what our viewers at home think about all this. But we've talked about support groups for the addicts. What about the parents who have questions? Do we have mechanisms available so that Ms. Brawley, when she has those questions, she can actually refer to someone, maybe not necessarily your organization, but another parent who's gone there or has those questions? We see it in AA with Al-Anon. There's kind of that, the support group, the enablers and so forth can meet and have discussions. Is there anything like that out there for the drug addiction?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, NA has an arm. There are places like Celebrate Recovery that do the same thing. There are many counselors in our community that do this type of work. And a lot of the times it's, as Susan said, it's about realizing what your role is in this process. And it doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. But it does, you have to realize boundaries are boundaries. And when you establish boundaries, you've got to keep those boundaries. Because that's how people learn. That's how people progress. But we have so many good resources here in town for families that are going through this, that are going through crisis. And, you know, there's a group of ladies that I know meets on Thursday mornings that met just this morning that are dealing with this. They're dealing with sons, daughters, husbands that are going through this type of stuff. They're a little bit harder to find because they are anonymous, and that's part of the nature of it. But at the same time, you know, they're out there, and we have parents that call us and say, if you have a parent call and needs to talk to somebody, just give my number. And we have many parents that were willing to do that.
We're getting close to the end of our program. I want to check it one more time with our social media desk. Honora, what's the latest?
Well, Mark, we've been talking a lot about rehab and getting that immediate help, but what about that next step? One viewer who wishes to remain anonymous asks, are there any places a young adult can go to get job skills and help after being arrested for drug possession? Mark, do our panelists know of any such programs?
Mr. Falls, a number of states, I think there's about 15 states so far, and about 100 cities have banned the box. That's on employment applications. Have you been convicted of a drug crime, or even sometimes have you been convicted of a crime? A lot of states are banning that. What is your sense on how does that help? Because we tend to believe, oftentimes we believe in redemption. We believe when someone's paid the price that perhaps they have an opportunity to reintegrate into society. You talked about recidivism. If it's difficult for people to reintegrate, it might continue that vicious cycle.
Right. So that really gets to the sense of punishment in the criminal justice system. As we look at alternatives to prison, whether that's a community corrections type program or community-based program, there's still this number of the population who says, well, if they've got this conviction on the record, then I know it's going to raise eyebrows somewhere down the line. Someone's going to be looking at them twice. Someone's going to be looking over their shoulder a little bit harder. And what you're saying really needs to be the focus. that if you go into the criminal justice system, whatever punishment, whatever sentence is meted out, that's it. You do that, and when it's over, you're done. When you have that, when you have to put that conviction down every time you go for a job, you're less likely to get that job. So we've got to get people away from that sense of, I want someone to have this conviction on the record for the rest of their life. That really is the sense. It's this idea that maybe the punishment in the criminal justice system wasn't quite enough. I want to make sure they really truly are punished down the line, and we're not going to make people any better by creating a system where the punishment lasts for the rest of their lives. At some point, we've got to say, okay, they've paid their debt to society. Let's let them move forward and try to make the entire community better.
Mr. Malloy, and this is going to be a tough question for you perhaps, because there are some people in society who suggest that if we decriminalize narcotics use, make it legal, bring it out of the shadows so that we know what the concentrations are, we know what the components are, we know that it hasn't been adulterated with some sort of additive, that it makes it a safer process. Then we can regulate it, we can tax it, we know who's using it. Your thoughts on that?
No. If you do that, then you'll just have a bunch of legal overdoses. I mean, I don't believe, that's just my personal opinion. I don't believe that that's the answer. What I do believe is part of the answer, at least in my opinion, is don't ever give up on any drug addict. Don't ever give up, because honestly, it took me 15 rehabs, and it took me not getting a whole bunch of jobs, and it took a lot of people being there for me to really finally get it. So I think that's a big part of the answer. I know I branched off from all what you said, but.
And I think I would add this too, is that if you legalize things, you can look at Colorado, you can look at Washington, what they're dealing with overdoses with children. You have so many children that are getting a hold of this, you know, for there it's pot, getting a hold of edible issues, or edible, they call them edibles, where they're taking pot and putting them into a candy, putting them into a brownie, and the kids are getting a hold of these. And where I said the issue is this, is that at the age of 18, you kind of have, you know, whatever your shot is normally to become an addict is what it is. Every year before that you take a drug, 17% more likely you're going to become an addict. If you look at alcohol, if you start using alcohol at the age of 14, you basically a 50-50 shot. It's 47% of becoming an alcoholic. And now we have kids, 2-year-olds, that are walking into ERs in Colorado because they're getting edibles, they're eating them because they think they're candy. And what is that going to do to our population later down the road?
Ms. Brawley, I have about a minute left. Have we lost the war on drugs?
I used to think we had, but I feel like we're gaining ground now, only because it's becoming a topic that we're talking about openly. I know when my son died, it's been 12 and a half years, and there was a stigma against talking about that sort of thing because people had a tendency to judge you based on your character. I mean, my son, people seem to think he lacked moral character. But I think now we're finally realizing that it's not about lack of moral character. It's about diseases, it's about poor choices, it's about addiction. And I'm just so happy that we're finally having these open discussions and that people finally are starting to realize that we need to remove the stigma. There was a good point made the other night on CBS Sunday. Anyway, there was a nurse that made the point that we don't stigmatize diabetics who are overweight and they overeat, they don't take care of themselves, and we don't stigmatize people who smoke and they end up with cancer and whatnot. Those are diseases just like addiction is a disease. So finally we are being frank and we're being open about it and we're realizing it for what it is. So to answer your question, I think finally maybe we're starting to gain ground because we're becoming more knowledgeable, and knowledge is power.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Our nation has waged a war on drugs for many years, and the targets have been everything from prescription pharmaceuticals to illicit drugs made in makeshift labs to exotic plants grown here and abroad. And the use and the misuse and abuse of these products have always created all sorts of problems. They have devastating consequences on families and neighborhoods, on entire communities. We hope that tonight we've provided some information that will help you in your family, your community, serve you as best as you can. On behalf of our panel of experts in ABC 33 and 40, I'd like to thank you at home for joining us. Make sure you join us on Facebook.com/ABC 3340. Tell us what you thought of tonight's roundtable. Of course, watch our late news for coverage of the roundtable and all the day's breaking news. And finally, we'd like to salute our military, law enforcement, firefighters, EMTs, and other emergency personnel for the support to our communities and our nation. I'm Mark Hyman. Good night.